Ladies and gentlemen,
Good evening.
Are you ready?
Okay, here we go.
You're listening to the Deal Room Podcast. Join us as we bring you the inside scoop on business sales and acquisitions. Get across trends in the area and hear the industry's best recount their real-life tips, traps, and experiences. Now, here's your host, Joanna Oakey.
Hi, it's Joanna Oakey here and welcome back to the Deal Room Podcast, a podcast proudly brought to you by our commercial legal practice, Aspect Legal. Now, today we have on the show Stephen Fine, the Managing Director at Growth Focus. Steve and I today talk all about the top considerations when buying and selling financial planning practices. We discuss who the usual buyers are for financial planning practices. We drill into a few case studies in this area. We touch on the mistakes made when selling a financial planning practice and the impact that we see from the changes in the market. So without further ado, let's get started with our discussion with Steve. Hi, Steve. Welcome back to the Deal Room Podcast.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. All right. Well, today we're talking all about the specific area of the top considerations when buying and selling financial planning practices. So let's start with maybe your background in financial planning practices, because I know this is a type of industry you deal with a lot.
Yes. Well, we've been facilitating the sale of financial planning practices for well over a decade now. Working with buyers and sellers and completing the transaction. So we've seen all sorts of transactions and structures and deals and how deals are being completed. So yeah, that's basically what we do. And that's our primary segment.
Okay, well, let's talk about financial planning practices as a whole. So let's start off with who are the usual buyers of financial planning practices? Because I guess there's a range, isn't there? Maybe talk to us about the usual buyers.
So the usual buyers are, you've got the larger practices who, may have made acquisitions in the past or on an acquisition trail, experienced buyers and, looking to grow that way. You may have, a one-off individual, one-man band as a buyer. They may not have purchased previously.
As in someone who's already a financial planner and who's then looking to acquire financial planning practice because it's already set up and it's going and it's proven, you've got clients.
Yes, so they get enough confidence to say, okay, look, it's time to expand things and acquisition is a good way to go. That type of buyer. So they may not have any buying experience, but they've got the planning experience and they've got the experience, running and managing a practice. And they're at a stage now where they are ready to take the next step.
Mm.
And then the third type of buyer is perhaps someone who hasn't run a practice. They may have been in employed capacity and they're ready to step up, run their own show. So those are the three types of buyers that we come across.
We also see buyers in this space that might perhaps might see financial planning as a good addition to their service offering. So that might be accounting practices or, those sorts of businesses. Do you see many of those types of buyers around at the moment?
Not that many. There were in the past where, it was, an aligned business who said, okay, look, let's have a go at this financial planning thing and see how it goes. But we're really not seeing a lot of that anymore.
And what do you think that is?
Well, I think those who have tried it before and really didn't understand the financial planning process and, what's involved, it's not as easy as it sounds. On paper, it's, okay, well, let's just buy this practice and then we'll have, it'll be aligned with what we do. And at the end of the day, there's got to be someone there who's really driving it. And I think that's the problem with that model. If the vendor exit, getting someone employed is different. They don't have the same drive and motivation that an owner would have.
Yeah.
I think that's really the key to that one.
Yeah.
So in short, no, we don't get a lot.
So if you're looking at acquisitions, and actually before I go there, maybe we step back because I feel like there's probably a few stories there you have of acquisitions that haven't quite gone to plan. Are there any sort of, examples that you've seen of buyers coming in, perhaps expecting the wrong thing out of the business, and then it just not turning out the way that they'd expected?
Yeah, I mean, I can think of one instance where a purchaser made an acquisition of a financial planning practice. The vendor was exiting. The vendor was actually going overseas, and the plan was, look, let's get somebody in to take over the business. It went pear-shaped because they had nominated a person. This person had said all the right things, that they were going to run the business, and they were working together for 3 months, and then this employed person decided that they wanted to go and do it themselves. And yeah, it wasn't a pretty picture because it was very unethical what the employed person did.
Wow. And so then left the new buyer without anyone to hold the clients and provide the services.
Exactly. So, I mean, that's kind of relates back to the issues of not being on the ground and not having control of the business.
Yeah. Well, taking it from a buy-side perspective, maybe if you can step out for us the sorts of things that you think buyers should be considering when they're looking to buy financial planning practice.
Look, I mean, there's the standard, looking at the quality of the business. I think what may be more of value is perhaps how to buy the business and what to consider. I mean, one of the mistakes that I see from buyers, and often it results in them not making a successful acquisition, is not detailing their offer. I'll give you an example. Buying a practice like this, there's so many other considerations. It's not like a widget in a store and you say, look, I'll pay X amount and thank you very much, let's wrap it up and off you go. There's emotions involved. There's questions around post-transaction. What's going to happen with the staff? Is the new acquirer going to gel with the clients? The key thing that I think is really important is when making an offer, detail the offer. A lot of buyers think, oh, look, I'll just put a multiple on there and the terms and that's enough. But you want to really, in presenting an offer, put forward what the plans are for the staff, put forward what the plans are for the location, put forward how the onboarding process is going to work, exactly what's required from the buyer to transition the clients across and introduce them to the new acquirer. So lack of detail in offers, I think, is one of the biggest mistakes that buyers make.
And that's interesting because the sorts of things that you're talking about, and you're talking about the discussion that you're having with the potential buyer that you're then, feeding back to the seller, or you suggesting that all of this should be in writing? I
am. We spend a lot of time on the heads of agreement. You could call the heads of agreement a terms document. It's not binding, but we encourage fleshing out as much detail as possible because it's going to come out, and you don't want it to come out after the transaction. Oh, I thought this was going to happen, or this was going to happen. Get it all discussed and clarified before the transaction occurs. Not to digress though. I mean, that's just standard practice for anything. I'm talking about for buyers though, because a lot of buyers, they come to us and they missed out on the last one and they missed out on the next one. And by the way, the way they go about it, you can actually get a sense of why they're missing out. And they're missing out because they're not going into the details in their offer. It's
an interesting approach because usually we'll see in these, heads of agreement or commercial terms or whatever you're calling them, we'll talk about price and payment and, perhaps ancillary documents that sit together with the transaction, the way in which the transaction will happen and perhaps exclusivity and a bit of confidentiality, but not so much these other areas that you're talking about, in terms of location and staff transition plans and all of those sorts of things. So that's a bit of a different approach, I guess, that you're bringing.
Yeah. I mean, if there was one takeaway, that's it, is it's not enough. Take extra time in the offers and cover off all of these factors. Because if you think of it from the seller's perspective, making this decision it's not easy. And these questions are going to be in the back of the seller's mind regardless. So address those questions in your offer. That's my key tip for buyers.
Fascinating, a way of approaching it. And how many buyers do you think go into that sort of, that you deal with? I mean, we don't see many, as I said, documents that contain all of that sort of information, but you do most of your buyers then, obviously this is something that you were suggesting to your buyers as part of the process, do many of them then come back with this detailed plan, or is this sort of an advice that you're giving to the buyers that is falling on deaf ears?
No, a lot of time we actually push for the information. If we're moving forward, we encourage and bring up, points that may not have even been considered for discussion. That helps the buyer actually get a successful result.
Yeah, and I think a lot of buyers, think from a very financial perspective, obviously, in relation to an acquisition. And many sellers come at it with perhaps a little bit more emotion of, they've built this business over years. And
definitely more emotion. And if you're looking at stories or just thinking of some examples where, a buyer came back to us and said, well, here's my offer. Why can I not get an answer on this? The seller cannot make a decision.
Yeah.
They need more.
Yeah. And often what's driving, we've had a few deals recently where our sellers have become really concerned about deals on the basis of how their staff will be treated, and how that continuity will happen, and the approaches that will be used for their clients. And it's interesting because sometimes this is very difficult for us to communicate to buyers who are just, who perhaps aren't tuned in to some of those concerns that might be playing in the mind of sellers. So it's such
Absolutely.
A good point, isn't it?
Yeah, I can think of a recent example where, look, you're a lawyer, and some of these, the intention of the parties, it's hard to actually put into a document, and that's why it's missed in a lot of documents. But this recent example was we had to actually articulate what the intentions are and what the view of the buyer of, what it looked like in 6 months, what it looked like in 12 months. That was really critical. It was a situation where the vendor was actually staying on in an employed capacity, but we had to talk about what the vision was so that the vendor could take comfort and say, okay, well, there's alignment there. And it's hard. I mean, how do you put that into a contract?
No, that's right. No, exactly. And it's all of this soft side that I think can be missed, and that is actually so critical, and sometimes can be the reason behind roadblocks that occur in deals. And when advisors aren't tuned into it, it can be perplexing that a deal suddenly falls over, and yet there have been red flags along the way because of a communication issue between a buyer and seller in terms of this vision or the treatment of elements that are of particular concern to the sellers, or indeed, on the flip side, the buyers. It's that EQ, the emotional intelligence, that's part of this game as well, right? So moving on to talk about the market a little bit in financial planning practices, obviously a lot has changed over recent years in the industry itself, the financial planning industry. So what impact has this had on value of financial planning practices and the saleability of financial planning practices?
The good news is the demand is still strong. There's more buyers than sellers. The multiples have come under pressure in the last couple of years. Compliance costs have gone up, insurance costs have gone up. So multiples have come down a little bit if we compare it to transactions that we were doing 3, 4, 5 years ago. But the demand is still strong.
Okay, great to hear, I guess, from your side of the fence as well. And so what sort of tips do you have for sellers then in the financial planning space?
We've got an ebook out which covers all the mistakes that vendors make when selling their practices. Happy to make that available to anybody. We've got a link on our website. You can download it. It talks about 5 key mistakes, but there's a lot of other considerations and a lot of other mistakes one can make. The whole premise is learn from other people's mistakes rather than learn from yourself.
And that, of course, is the whole reason for the Deal Room podcast itself as well. And just as a quick snapshot then for our listeners, what are those 5 key mistakes?
Not having good data is the key one. Absolutely.
As in not being prepared with their data to hand over during due diligence? Is that what you mean? No,
before due diligence. We have a whole lot of templates that we work with vendors on, a master Excel sheet. And the more data we've got there, the better. It adds value to the practice, absolutely. It speeds up the process considerably, reduces the backward forward Q&As. Good data is absolutely critical. I'm not talking about at the due diligence stage. I'm talking before you actually take the business to market. So that's the key one. The second one is knowing exactly what you want. A lot of vendors will go into a discussion and, they have an approach. Well, let's see how it goes. We think that's a mistake. We spend a lot of time with vendors articulating what their ideal outcome is, what's the ideal scenario in a perfect world. And, just like the buyers being very specific about detail, we encourage vendors to be as specific as they can. Doesn't mean it's going to turn out that way, but at least you've got an aspiration outcome to shoot for. Because if you don't, you're kind of just blowing in the wind, and oftentimes you'll just go in the direction that the buyer wants to take you in. So yeah, being clear on what you want is pretty important. I mean, we've got a whole lot of exercises as well. We've got a tool called Inflection Questionnaire, where we ask vendors a whole lot of questions. Some are factual questions, some are kind of emotional. How would you feel in a situation like this, or how would you feel having to report to someone in a transition? We get the data from that and go back to them and say, look, you've said this is your aspiration, but your questions, there's a few little conflicts here. We're going to just discuss this before we finalize what you're shooting for and what outcome you're aiming for.
And I guess those two areas that you talked about so far, those top two mistakes, the preparation of data and then being clear on outcomes, do you think that's particular to the financial planning industry, or
no?
I
think it's common across all sectors.
Yeah. And is there anything that you see in the financial planning industry itself that you feel is, a particular nuance that perhaps sellers or even buyers in the industry miss and just don't realize that is quite different to other business sales?
There's nothing specific that jumps out for financial planning. It's going to be similar to any service transaction where you're not selling. The asset you're selling is really the relationships of the clients.
It is. That's right. It's the relationship, isn't it? And I guess it's a bit like an accounting practice.
Same thing. Yeah.
There can be very, very strong relationships between, and whilst it might be the same in any professional services business, I think there is this sort of element when finances are involved. So your financial planning practices, your accounting practices, where that relationship between the advisor and the end client can be very close. And I guess then in those situations, the particular issue that we have to manage is how is it that we ensure that when there's a transmission of business that our clients stay. And, quite often we'll have a retention to deal with that. But retention is only a component of the sale price, sometimes 10, 20%. And so you've still got the balance that's exposed if you haven't, from a buy side perspective, if you haven't found a way to properly transition the clients. And then from a sell side perspective, of course, you've got the retention. You've got the retention at risk. So what's some examples that you've seen of how from a practical perspective, we can help to ensure that value properly transfers between the seller and the buyer in this tricky situation of dealing with human relationships?
Again, it just comes back to detail and discussing and scenarios. We often find, being in the middle, two parties agree and they say, let's go. Everyone's excited. And we're sitting there on the sidelines. We go, there's a few more things we actually need to discuss. What's going to happen on such and such a date? How's it? What is your role going to be? Like we can actually see it, where the buyer and seller may not see it. They just, too quick to conclude the transaction, not realize that there's potentially going to be some issues that come up afterwards.
Yeah.
So both buyers and sellers, we're really strong on talking scenarios. Do you realize that, by month 2, it's going to look like this, you're going to be doing this, the seller's going to be doing this, the buyer's going to be doing that. Is that how you see it? And just revisit all of that. Just keep asking those questions. We found ourselves actually bringing these things up quite regularly.
And so what's an example that you've seen? Do you recall an instant where this transition had been done really, really well? Like, do you recall any instances where you thought, oh gosh, they nailed it?
Yes, this one transition which worked so smoothly. The buyer and the seller were very, very similar when they did the transition. They had, it worked beautifully. They had the same interests. They did the same hobbies, and it was almost like, from the client's perspective, that so similar. So that transition was particularly smooth, very, very seamless.
So you're saying that the end clients sort of had this, the replacement advisor to them felt so similar to the first, that there was this smoothness in the transition.
Yeah. It doesn't mean don't do transactions if you're not similar to the
fascinating.
To the seller.
I love that we have to go and personality profile all our buyers now and our sellers and match them up, and
yeah.
So maybe that's an approach. Maybe that's not a bad thing to add into look at this. We're innovating as we go here, Steve.
Yeah.
Okay. And then on the flip side, and just to give us a little bit more context, okay, so this worked really smoothly because there's a lot of similarity between the vendor and the buyer. Was this a practice where there were, not many other staff, or what was sort of the size of the practice here? And were there other, elements, I guess? Was it an individual buying in, to replace a job, or what were the other elements?
It was an individual buying in this who had an existing business which was the same size as the vendor's business.
Got it.
I mean, it was fairly sizable because these were high net worth clients.
Yep.
The relationships were with the key individuals.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then, so on the flip side, you probably know where I'm about to go, but have you got, in mind any examples of where this was done really badly and you look back and you go, oh gosh, that was an example of how not to do it?
I can think of an example where the vendor wanted to get out a lot earlier and the seller wanted the vendor to stay a lot longer. And there was conflict. It was very frustrating for the vendor. They felt locked in. They felt as if they were locked in because the purchaser, after the purchase, wasn't under pressure to relieve them so that they could exit. And that got very, very frustrating for the seller as time went by.
Oh boy, I think you're hitting on, that is a classic example of where issues tend to creep up, where the seller is just staying on board just for too long. And I think ultimately it comes back to a couple of things, really. Once someone has run their own business, they find it very hard to continue to operate under someone else's, reign.
Sure, absolutely. Taking instruction.
Yeah,
and there's always going to be new systems introduced. When you've sold your business, the last thing you really want to do is learn a new system.
Yeah.
You're probably thinking about the beach and the golf course.
That's right.
If it's a retirement, and now you've got to learn a new system. Like, didn't anticipate this.
I've heard people describe that period, the period of staying on after the sale of their business, as one of the most horrible things they've ever had to do in their entire life. Yes. So I think, from a buy side, you just have to be aware of this. And if you think that part of the value to you is dependent on the seller staying on board, you just need to be aware that might not be a happy place for them. And if it's not a happy place for them, it may not end up being a happy place for you either. So, I think it's, having a complete, at least understanding that is a very common outcome, helps you work out whether there's alternatives or what to put in place to try and avoid those sorts of issues from appearing. And I think, particularly so when there's earnouts or where there's money on the line for sellers, it can seem like a great idea to a buyer, and it can be a great idea. But if there's not enough there in terms of motivation for the seller, or the seller is already out the door in terms of from an emotional perspective, or what they want to be doing, handcuffing them to the business can be, can just create friction. So I think it's really important to be aware of that. So it's fascinating that you brought that up.
I mean, yeah. Another example was when a vendor actually disagreed with the strategies that were being presented to the client.
Yeah. Yeah.
Doesn't mean the strategies were wrong. It's just the vendor didn't agree with them.
Oh, I've seen that play out as well.
They couldn't, in good faith, take instruction or go in the direction the business wanted to go in, because fundamentally they were, they didn't have faith in that direction and that advice.
Yeah. What do you suggest then to avoid that sort of issue from occurring?
Detail beforehand.
Yeah.
Scenarios, asking more questions, really.
Or get them out of the business quickly, I guess.
Or get them out of the business. Exactly.
But that doesn't always work. Sometimes, it's really important for transition of the value. And we talked about, the elements of a financial planning practice that mean in some instances, it really makes sense for there to be this proper transition. But I guess it's just making sure you're coming at it from a perspective where you're understanding the human psychology of the seller, and you've found a way, and it might even be about getting the right advisors on board to help with that direction. Well, look, I just want to say a huge thank you, Steve, for coming on to the Deal Room podcast. Is there anything else about the financial planning, sale and acquisition world you feel like we haven't touched on that we should dig into?
Look, it's active. It's changing. There's a lot of consolidation happening at the moment. It's interesting to see how, various parties value the businesses. Look, we enjoy it. It keeps us on our toes. We meet some really interesting characters along the way. Make some good friends along the way. So we're enjoying it. We're in for the long haul.
Brilliant. Well, look, Steve, I just want to say a massive thank you for coming on to the Deal Room podcast today. And if any of our listeners want to reach out to you, and if they want to get a copy of this 5 mistakes ebook for selling a financial planning practice, how do they go about doing that?
Yeah, you can download it off our website, growthfocus.com.au, and you'll find a little link. There's a couple of other ebooks available as well. There's one if you're looking at a lot longer horizon, 5-6 years. That's a separate ebook with a whole lot of separate considerations.
Fabulous. Okay, wonderful. Well, look, thank you once again, Steve, for coming on to the Deal Room podcast.
Thank you.
Well, that's it for this episode of the Deal Room podcast, all about the top considerations when buying and selling financial planning practices. Just a quick recap. In this episode, we talked about who the usual buyers are for financial planning practices, the mistakes sellers usually make when selling financial practices, and we also, of course, touched on a case study showing how value transfers between the seller and the buyer. Well, that's it. If you'd like to find out more information about this topic, then head over to our website at www.thedealroompodcast.com, where you'll be able to download a transcript of this episode if you'd like to read it in more detail. There you'll also be able to find details of how to contact Stephen Fine at Growth Focus, and of course you'll also be able to find details of how to contact our legal eagles at Aspect Legal if you or your clients would like to discuss any legal aspects of sales or acquisitions. We've got a number of great services that help businesses both prepare for a sale or acquisition and also to work through the sale or acquisition in process. We work with clients both big and small and have different types of services depending on size and complexity. So don't hesitate to book an appointment if you'd like to find out how we might be able to assist. And finally, if you enjoyed what you heard today, then don't forget to pop over to iTunes and leave us a review. Well, that's it. Thanks again for listening in. You've been listening to Joanna Oakey and the Deal Room podcast, a podcast proudly brought to you by our commercial legal practice, Aspect Legal. See you next time. Aspect Legal has a number of great services that help businesses prepare for a sale or acquisition, to help them prepare in advance and to get transaction ready. We've also got a range of services to help guide businesses through the sale and acquisitions process. We work with clients both big and small and have different types of services depending on size and complexity. We provide a free consultation to discuss your proposed sale or acquisition. So see our show notes on how to book a time to speak with us, or head over to our website at aspectlegal.com.au.
Ladies and gentlemen.
That will conclude this evening's entertainment. Thanks for listening to the Deal Room podcast. To find out more about this episode and other episodes in the series, check out the show notes or head over to our website at thedealroompodcast.com.au.